I'd like to call the monthly public safety committee meeting to order. Before we get to the agenda items, I'd ask that we have a moment of silence for the victims of the Virginia Beach shooting last week. Here we are in a municipal center, and we all can relate to that tragedy, and hope we can find viable solutions to prevent that from happening here or anywhere else in America. So if we could just take a few minutes to reflect, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. The first item of business is an ordinance of the town of West Hartford designating intersections to be regulated against blockage under Connecticut General Statute Section 14-250BA. So I guess town engineer Martin from our deputy corporation officer. You want to enlighten us as to the topics?
Sure.
What you're looking for with respect to the council action?
Absolutely. So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Wayne Martin. I'm the West Hartford Town Engineer. And so before you tonight is an ordinance that we are interested in putting in place. It's a little bit of an education for me as to the ordinance. We have a few locations in town where we have pavement markings and signage on public streets that's intended to prevent traffic from stopping at those locations. You'll see they have white paint, usually in a hatch pattern, and then some type of signage that essentially says do not block the driveway or the intersection. Well, come to find out, these are technically not enforceable without an ordinance. And so the state requires that we have an ordinance in place. Every municipality has an ordinance in place. And the ordinance is supposed to specifically identify the locations where the do not block the box applications are located. So you'll see there's a few listed on the proposed ordinance in front of you there. There is some criteria as to where these are allowed to be located. In most cases, you'll see them located on multi-lane roadways. And the reason for that is the typical situation that happens where traffic may queue or back up through a driveway or an intersection. And it could be a motorist, as an example, is trying to exit the driveway. So you'll have a motorist sitting in the road, and they'll wave to the motorist to exit the driveway. The motorist proceeds into the roadway, and then another car comes up on the adjacent road and hits them and crash. So the markings are intended to help with that and try and keep communications a little bit safer. So you'll see there are 3 that are listed there. We actually have 3 presently in town. We're proposing a 4th. So the 3 that are listed there, New Park Ave at 470 New Park Avenue driveway, which is a CT fast track station. That's already out there. That was requested by the state to allow easier access to and from the fast track station. The second one is Raymond Road, of course, at the police and fire driveway there, for obvious reasons to allow the emergency vehicles to exit more readily. And then the third one is proposed Route 4 at Everett Avenue. Technically, that's a state highway, but we worked with the neighborhood residents about concerns that they had for safe access to the neighborhood using Everett. And when we did research for crashes that occurred there, we found that there was an elevated number. So we received approval from the state DOT, Department of Transportation, to install a left turn lane on Farmington Ave in westbound direction for Everett. And then also paint a do not block the box application there. The criteria essentially is for safety benefits, as I mentioned. It can go, it's supposed to be at intersections, not driveways. That was one of the criteria. The other is it can be at a driveway if it's for a state facility or for an emergency vehicle scenario, which we have a couple of those. There is another one in town that we intend to leave, but it's not going to be enforceable, but it's been there for quite some time for traffic safety reasons. You might be familiar, it's on Farmington Ave in the center at a Bank of America exiting driveway. Very close to Main Street there. There was a high level of crashes that were occurring there. So we went in, unbeknownst to us, there's supposed to be an ordinance, and technically it's not allowed at driveways. But looking back after it was installed, it has improved safety in the driveway, so I'm not proposing to remove it. It just won't be technically enforceable by way of the ordinance.
It's also very effective when you're going in and out of that bank. I can't believe the difference it makes, holy,
Yeah.
big time. So thank you.
Yeah, so assuming the ordinance is approved, it will be put in place. The panel markings that we have out there, except for the one that's proposed on Farmington and Everett, that will be installed, will stay there. The signage in most of the locations is either incorrect or needs to be supplemented with a sub-plaque that will have reference to the fine that can be levied for people that are blocking the box. And Garmin's here, if you have any legal questions, he was drafting the ordinance for us.
Anyone have any questions? No questions? I presume this will be on our next agenda. Thank you. We're going to move on to the major topic for tonight, which is the fire department efficiency and effectiveness. I'd like to thank Jen Evans from Channel 5 Local Access for filming this so that members of our council who are not present, as well as others in our community who may be interested in this topic, will be able to hear the discussion this evening. And I really appreciate the volunteerism to make that happen. And, thank you for a veteran. So with that said, Aaron, would you like to start?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's meeting. This is a very important meeting, very important project for the town. Again, we appreciate the council's support for funding this project. I do want to make an apology up front. The General Assembly is in session right now, and I'm being called by various members of our delegation to respond to questions, etc. So if I go in and out of the room, that's the reason why. But very happy to have our fire department management team here this evening, as well as the consultant team from Fitch and Associates, Dr. Stephen Knight and Dr. Bruce Muller. And council, you've had an opportunity to meet with them previously, and they're here tonight to present their final report. We have various paper copies of the study, if you'd like one. We have also, Brittany has also loaded everything up on board docs as well, including tonight's PowerPoint presentation is on the board doc system. And then we have prepared a proposed review schedule as requested by Chairman Davidoff, by Councilor Davidoff, which we can discuss later on. So I would like to turn it over to Steve and Bruce to walk us through the presentation. And I think it would be best, actually, if council members held on questions until they at least make the bulk of the presentation, then we can have as long of a Q&A as you would like.
Thank you.
Okay,
All yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thanks for having us back. So what we're going to do tonight is give you a high-level briefing on the PowerPoint from the collective of the substantive elements from our report that we provided. Most of this is similar to what you saw the last time we presented to you as an interim briefing. There's a few pieces that we have updated since then that we'll specifically draw your attention to as we walk through. And as the manager indicated, you can handle your questions however best fits your format, but we're open to however you want to handle that. So, and we're looking for about maybe 30 minutes. Is that acceptable?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. So we broke it up into different sections. The first piece is really to look at the community response history. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's actually occurring. In 2017, nearly 10,000 unique incidents occurred within the township. 26.6 total calls per day, and the majority of those, 18.5, are EMS calls. And if you look at the pie graph, the pie chart there, you can see that EMS is really the predominant request for service that comes from the community, which is pretty common in what we see across the nation. In fact, in integrated systems, wouldn't be surprised to see that increase upwards of 75 to 80% as you continue to be more involved in emergency medical services. That's a pretty typical experience across the nation. The historical demand Again, if we looked at it from 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, you can see what the total call volume and the relationship between EMS and fire-related incidents. And then, of course, the specialty teams and requests for service, like technical rescue or hazardous materials, things like that, are much less frequent. And then the other thing I'll draw your attention to here, and I have another chart that spells it out a little greater, but you can see it's a gentle uptick in the request for service, which is what we see nationally as well. The temporal demand, what we looked at here is really, when we looked at the calls for month per year, the calls week per day, et cetera, there's nothing really discernible that you could make any kind of resource allocation decision on. For example, there isn't a big enough difference between your low month and your high month to allocate anything differently. But during the peak of the day, so if you look at these charts, it starts at 0, which is a military clock for midnight, and runs all the way to 11 p.m. If you look at it across there, you can see that you're really 2 to 3 times busier during the peak of the day than you are overnight, which is pretty common experience that we see across the nation. The only time it breaks from this general pattern, the numbers may be much higher or lower, but the general pattern follows this across the nation, is if there's a real a high college presence or night time, like a Las Vegas or something like that, might have a pretty steady across the board. But in most communities that serve as bedroom communities, this is a typical approach that we see. The 90th percentile response times, we talked a little bit about. The report shares both averages and 90th percentile. So if you're not familiar with the 90th percentile, very briefly, what that says is that 9 out of 10 times, the level of service that is stated in your performance objectives or better is what occurs. So I'll draw your attention here to the travel time. If you come over to travel time, as an agency, you're at 6.5 minutes, which is 6 minutes and 30 seconds at the 90th percentile travel time. So 90% of all your calls are handled in 6.5 minutes or less in your travel time. If you look at the turnout time, that's measured from once the units are notified that there's a call to the time that they're out of the station and indicate that they're responding to the call. So one of the things we did talk about internally with the department is looking at that turnout time and trying to improve that. That's generally a no-cost option. It's under management control to address that. But in our dialogue with the department, they felt like there were some technology and process issues that may contribute to that. So we left it out of the report, but we talked about it internally, and they're gonna do their own due diligence internally to make sure that they can get an accurate reading on that before they move forward. The dispatch time we talked about briefly last time, and the next slides I'll show you, that's one of our updates. We went back into the data after the first run and tried to discern the dispatch time to a little bit more granular level, and I'll walk you through that. And then again, you can see that EMS is the lion's share of the program requests from the community. So what we did on the dispatch, a distinction, and I don't want to get too in the weeds on the data processing, but in the previous slide, those analyses are done at the unique call level. So every time a call is created in the 911 system, we track the call all the way through for the units that are assigned, and each call has its own value. But that wasn't serving what we felt is probably a better experience in the dispatch center. So we went back into the data, and what we looked at, instead of which unit arrived first, we just pulled out the first unit dispatched. So regardless of whether the unit arrived or not, we're really talking on this slide, we're talking specifically about dispatch's experience. So for them to get the call, process the call, and dispatch that first unit, you can see those values, and I'll go back just so you can see. So if you look at the 90th percentile, EMS is 3 minutes, fire is 4.9. If I go back to this, looking at the call level, dispatch is 3.5, so not a huge variance, but about 30 seconds, but fire is certainly elongated significantly, and that would be a pretty aberrant look. So we've cleaned that up, so we removed all outliers, and in your data there was quite a bit of variability in your data, a lot of outliers. So what we did is we pulled out anything that was greater than 30 minutes, which is really long. So we felt safe on safe ground there. We're not skewing the analysis at all. And we looked at the first dispatched unit. One of the challenges, and each CAD system will do it differently, but if it starts as a police department call, law enforcement call, for example, and then maybe 10, 12, 20, 30, 40 minutes into the call, it migrates into an EMS call. Someone now has chest pain, there's some other condition that occurred, and then they introduce the fire department, that we feel was contributing to those elongated times. And other CAD systems, the fire-related incident would get its own unique identifiable number, so you could separate out the performance. So that's why we looked at it two ways, to give a little bit better description of really what's going on in your dispatch center.
Before you go on.
Sure.
There are some people on the line. Can we find out who's on the line?
Absolutely.
Leave that line.
Anyone else other than Liam? Counselor Sweeney? Thanks, Liam.
Understand, enter the building, be there a minute.
Okay, thanks. All right,
Continue.
we're good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So this is a distribution that we looked at just to show you that 86% of the calls were dispatched in 3 minutes or less overall. And you can see where the difference performance windows and their 15-second blocks. So you can see there's a lot of good performance that's going on. I will say that nationally we would want that to be 2 minutes or less in a dispatch center today. So there's still an opportunity for some improvement there, but we certainly wanted to make sure that we reflected a more accurate description of what the performance was today. Another analysis that we did, we really looked at all the units that you had in the system. And what we did is, so if you can look across the bottom, it has 0 unit, 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit, 5 units. So you have to look at it almost from right to left. So 35% of the time, if you follow that red line all the way up, 35% of the time, all 5 units were available when a call came in to respond. And then the blue line is the average, and the green line is the 90th percentile for the response time performance. So what you really see is there's a pretty flat relationship between the number of available units and the overall performance until you draw down to 2 units or less. So then once you get to 2 units in the system, then the response time really starts to elongate. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we looked at your performance with the station locations. So generally in the industry, what we try to do is make sure that whatever performance window you adopt, that you achieve at least 90% of all the incidents in that performance window. That's really the high validity best practice measure. So understand, if you go back, you were at 6.5 minutes as a municipality in your overall travel time. And we focus on travel time because that's what the GIS relates to. But if we look at that, your agency, if you just use stations 2, 3, and 4, are able to hit 92.37% of all the calls just from those 3 stations within a 6-minute travel time. So there's a good opportunity for you to have some capital opportunity for you as you consider your future and how you want to staff the units. And we'll come back to this scenario in one of our pieces, one of our alternatives that we modeled for you earlier. So the other 2 stations are still there, but you can see all of the green areas are what's captured within 6 minutes. And then any of the progressively darker green areas are where 2 stations overlap and both stations can cover that geographic part of that polygon in the same 6 minutes. So there's some duplication there. And then understanding that it's at 92.37%, any of the areas that are white, that don't have the coloring, either have no calls or are outside of that 6 minutes. So then we took and we said, what if we took a whiteboard approach? We call it an optimized station location. And really what this says is, forget where the stations are, forget whether there's available land, forget whether or not you want to spend the money to purchase additional land. But if we just let the data tell the story on where the station should be located, there's some good news here. One is it didn't come up with anything materially better. The different stations, so you can see up top there, your northernmost station, station 4, is right on target with our own analysis. There's a marginal movement in the center part and then a marginal movement on the south. But in total, this only accounts for about 95% coverage and your previous was at 92, almost 93%. So there's really only about a 2.5% improvement versus the return on investment for the capital movement. So I don't know that I would recommend considering this as a proactive approach, but when you have to replace the station, you might want to pick up a % or 2 improvement if you're able to relocate the stations as you move forward. And then one of the other pieces that we look at, and I think this is important for an agency your size, and that's called the effective response force, if you're not familiar. And really what the effective response force is it's a measure of making sure that you have enough firefighters on the scene in order to actually mitigate the event. Now, the good news is most of your events are EMS related, where there's a closer relationship to a single resource fixing the problem, mitigating the incident. Much lower frequency, but structure fires are a good example. Not a great, really high frequency, kind of a low frequency event, but it takes a lot of firefighters in order to do that. It's not a 2 firefighter operation. So what we looked at is trying to assemble an effective response force. The 8, 10, and 12 minutes, the 8 minutes is really what the National Fire Protection Agency recommends. It's a really aggressive measure. Most agencies can't really meet that. The 10-minute is closer to what the Commission on Fire Accreditation International recognizes, which is the accrediting body for fire services. If you're familiar with CALIA from the law enforcement side, it's the equivalent for fire. And they afford actually 10 minutes and 24 seconds, but we modeled 10 minutes, and then we went up to 12 minutes as well. The real takeaway here is, if you look at the current, one, I think you'd recognize that with your current staffing, you're going to be challenged to assemble a whole lot of people all at once across your geography. It's not an uncommon problem with agencies your size. But what we did look at is if you had 3-person staffing with EMS, which is what was contemplated at the time we put this together and later ratified with your contract, with the collective bargaining process, is that it shows that as long as you are reallocating those personnel to other units and the same number of firefighters are on the street and you're deploying from the same stations, you can see it's an identical experience for assembling the effective response force, so that's good. Now, the next one, the last one, the 3-person staffing with no ALS or EMS, if you didn't reallocate those resources but reduced those resources, then you would actually degrade your ability from at least the current status quo of your capability of assembling the effective response force, at least to the level of service that you have today. So staffing considerations, by collective bargaining agreement, your minimum staffing is 21. And we're just kind of showing how it's assembled today. Now, obviously, with the contract being ratified in between the last time we were here and now, you're able to pull off 4 of those units, the 1 person, and assemble 2 2-person crews to however you want to manage that. And we'll walk through some of our alternative analyses on that. But that's your general lay of the land in the minimum staffing state at 21. But something we wanted to point out, we took all of the average leave for the 2017 period of all the personnel that are assigned to shift. And just for an understanding standpoint, it takes 4.64 people to staff every seat. So what that means is for your 21 minimum staffing, you would need 97 personnel total to staff all your shifts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on that schedule. Does that make sense? Fair? Okay. So here's the current model. Some of the challenges with it. It's a little less efficient use of personnel by sending 4 firefighters on medical calls that could be handled by 2. Excessive wear and tear on the fire apparatus. Most communities are sensitive to using the typical example. It's $1 million ladder truck that's running ground level falls and twisted ankles, things like that. Fire apparatus have to pick up the paramedic at the hospital, taking the apparatus out of service at times. And will likely need to purchase additional resources to maintain the level of service due to the increasing demand. So as you increase your demand over time, you're eventually going to have to reinvest in order to continue to maintain performance and manage the workload. One of the things we did measure is it's called unit hours utilization, and this is a measure of time on task. So it's measured from the time that the units are dispatched until the time the units say that they're available and ready for another call. So what this doesn't include is non-emergency activities. So other things like health and wellness, public education, fire prevention efforts, training, all of those non-emergency activities aren't captured in here. Theoretically, if you think about this, that line up there is at 30%. There was actually the International Association of Firefighters recommendation in their first edition of their Fire EMS Handbook. It's one of the areas where we can actually agree with the IAFF on that particular issue. We manage our own ambulance systems and we try to keep them around 25, no greater than 30% on a 24-hour shift. Now, what that translates to, let's just say you're at, we'll be, for round numbers, we'll say 30% equals approximately 8 hours of the 24 hours. What that means is 8 hours a day is the maximum to run 911 related calls. The other 16 hours would be afforded, hopefully, some sleep, eating some meals, health and wellness, training, and all those non-emergency activities. So that's kind of why that shapes out. And it's difficult to contemplate sometimes when you think about an office setting, right? Because they're going to work 100% of the time. One of the avenues with the UHU, it's a measure of workload on the people. So it's more of a people issue unless other measures translate. So if the workload gets really high, eventually you'll see problems in the performance, right? Because if let's just say these units worked 100% of the time, that means that they wouldn't be available to respond to calls when people call 911. So there has to be a balance between availability and performance. And that's the difference between a demand model or a production model and a readiness model. And the fire service is much more of a readiness model. So again, at 25%, we really use that as our planning threshold because it may take 1, 2, 3 budget cycles in order to get the investment that you need to fix your workload problems. So in the not too distant future, you're going to have some workload related investment, in our opinion, if you follow that. So you can see that the Engine 4 and Engine 2 are both over 20%. So not too many years in the future, you're going to have to reinvest along those avenues. And then here's your linear growth. When we looked at this, the low was about 5%, the high was almost 14%, and then the average between those was basically 9%. So those are your 3 lines. And what it does is it marched out 5 years of growth, and then we assume from a linear aspect that all the assumptions, all the experiences, everything that occurred in the last 5 years will continue in the future. So we don't put a lot of weight on an analysis like that because there's a lot of dynamics that can influence that. But at least it gives you some trajectory, and what we recommend to the department is they just continue a 5-year rolling average to manage growth so that they can have accurate predictions moving forward. But if you look at the middle line, that's kind of the annualized impact, and it's right around 9%. That would be the middle line. The 5% would be the bottom line, and then of course if you continue to 13%, which we don't acknowledge, that's probably not going to hold true. What we see across the nation, though, is about 3 to 7% growth, and nearly all the growth is in the EMS-related activity. So now we're going to talk about some EMS deployment options. So when we looked at the deployment, we put together a myriad of scenarios of what you could do moving forward, and just some very broad assumptions. And we took the time to work with your budget office and your department staff just to make sure that all of our assumptions pass the common sense test, pass the general accounting and budgeting practices that they had, so that we try to present it in a manner that you would generally accept. On the capital, we looked at ambulances purchased with all the equipment rather than separated. We use a 1.3 to 1.5 ratio for spare ambulances versus deployed. And that would hold true for chase car vehicles as well. Spare biomedical equipment was included, vehicle equipment allocation, and we amortize that over a 5-year schedule. Salaries we based off of the union and historical time off. And then the volumes, we try to be conservative on those, a 1% increase in demand, 1% increase in collections, and then the 2.5% on the CPI, and the revenue per trip. And then the equipment is normalized item across all that. So just some background assumptions of how we came to some of the numbers. When we looked at the revenue, we specifically broke out the revenue based on the BLS rate, the ALS rate, ALS2, et cetera, and you can see the different values across that. So if you were to transport and you were able to collect the entire amount, our estimate is right around $2.2 to $2.3 million worth of revenue if you were able to collect the entire amount. At the time that we had put this together, the most recent budget had right around $897,000, somewhere around in that range. Our projections came out at 909, so that lined really well with your actual experience. But the current revenues dropped, which I know you're aware of with the bundle billing challenges that you've had. So the current revenue is really down to 650, and somewhere around 250,000 is what we estimated for that bundle billing piece. And then as you go forward and evaluate both with us and externally to us and internally to your township, we used a 50-50 split between your bundle billing strategy, which is generally what we see in the industry and what we've negotiated ourselves through our management contract. So that's what we use. Obviously, budget is aware of that. We've had discussions with Peter. So anything that you do internally, you have to adjust those accordingly, depending on what your negotiations were. So let's look at if we didn't do ALS. So if we backed away from the ALS, really it's a policy choice to respond to the EMS incident. So if you weren't providing ALS services, you're only providing BLS. The reason we framed it that way to no medical response is you'll inherit the vast majority of the costs if you still responded to all the EMS calls in a BLS capacity. So you'd lose some revenue, you'd save some of the stipend dollars, but it would really be a net loss for you to do so. So the decision would then migrate to, from a policy perspective, of whether or not you wanted to respond to those calls, what's the community expectation, things like that. So that's really why we framed it that way. It doesn't materially change the staffing considerations for how you want to provide your fire suppression activity. Our understanding from a historical perspective, when we talked with administration and the fire administration, is that you really took a in-kind, you used the capacity that you had within the system to spin up your ALS program. So to remove the ALS program, it would be a different policy journey to drop the staffing down from pre-ALS days. So we held it constant to that. Lost revenue from the paramedic intercept billing, you reduced ALS stipend, direct materials, et cetera. And then of course, we estimated that you probably have to reintroduce AMR contractual relationship, and we really have no bearing on what that would be, but at least in 2014, we know that you did contract for that from AMR, and it was $310,000 annually to do so, because AMR likely is realizing some benefit from you providing ALS first response that they're able to translate to their business model. So if they were to then have to reintroduce ALS on their end, they're likely going to pass on some kind of subsidized contractual cost to do so. So the consideration here, just as a summary, performance is less control for medical first response. If you weren't providing it, fire department would only respond to about 30% of the calls if you backed away from it entirely and only went to the most serious calls. Some of the challenges is establishing the contractual relationship and making sure that that's sustainable. I will share that in the industry, it's pretty unstable right now, where many times we see clients and municipalities receiving requests for greater subsidy because the profit margin is down as an industry in the private ambulance market. So, and then you'd likely have to subsidize medical first response, and then again, that really comes back to the sustainability piece. That's a policy choice of what your risk tolerance is associated with that. And then again, from a fiscal perspective, you really are going to be almost, $800,000, $900,000 as a cost between the lost revenue and the additional cost for the AMR contract, and that is less the ALS stipend, which that also could be a contractual piece of how you would disentangle from that. But it would be a costly endeavor to try to back away from it from now. Alternatives as a result of the negotiation, and I know it's ratified and solidified at this point, but the union concession to repurpose the fourth person from 4 out of the 5 apparatus to an EMS mission, I would compliment the union on that. That's very progressive. It's rarely seen in the industry, but it's fantastic. That's the way negotiations should work. And it recognizes the need is shifting from a pure fire suppression model. And I just wanted to point out that that's a big win for both sides to do so. It provides an opportunity to begin to establish a more sustainable staffing strategy for the future. One of the challenges most communities have, and I don't know that you're that different, is translating a traditional fire suppression model to handle an EMS-related issue. And that's really the crossroads that we see you at, where you could start readjusting how you allocate resources, staffing, personnel, et cetera, towards the EMS mission. Opportunity to measure the impacts of the staffing reduction and support future policy choices. So you develop the strategy to move slowly through that. Increases efficiency by utilizing the excess capacity for most of the frequent community requests for service and respond to approximately 75% of these calls. Could be done through lighter, less costly vehicles to do so. So let's talk about the chase car model. So if we did a chase car coverage consideration, so the chase cars are modeled using 2-person staffing. And under the agreement, you leverage 4 FTEs per day, 4 personnel per day to address 2 independent units. So you could put them, and there's a little bit of a split camp. When we did a risk analysis, stations 2 and 4 carry the greatest risk, and looking at the geography, it probably makes good sense to do 2 and 4 because then you converge towards the middle. But if you wanted to capture the greatest percentage of calls, actually stations 2 and 3 would be the stations to put that at. So there's not necessarily a hard line, right or wrong answer, whether you pick stations 2 or 3 or stations 2 and 4. We'll leave that to the department, but those are the 2 competing lenses to come to that decision on how you wanted to staff those 2. The remaining stations would continue to provide service as they do today, maintains the current paramedic intercept revenue, so no changes there, and reduces the use of the heavy fire apparatus, at least to some degree. So one of the challenges with that, well, I'll come back to that in just a second. So when we looked at this, that you really maintain, you were about 417, if you didn't catch it on one of the other slides today, in the net revenue that we projected. So you would be about 424. There's some minor differences just in our calculations and assumptions, but largely you remain just the way you are today because you're taking those personnel in kind and you're running the same number of calls and having the same number of ALS calls. So nothing really would change materially on that. The challenge is it doesn't provide a uniform deployment strategy, and this is why. We use this is an 8-minute travel time. And it's only for illustration, but one of the scenarios we ran at the request of the department was, what if we combine stations 1 and 2 and located it here, which we modeled, and then the other station there. So we took the new location of a combined 1-2 that the department gave us and reran our model. And at 8 minutes, it would only take station 4 and the new station 1-2 in order to cover the city, the township in 8 minutes. But this is why I bring this up. If you go back to this, in order to hit 90% of all the calls in 6 minutes, you really need all 3 stations with a unit to deploy from. So if you only have 2, whether they're ambulances or chase cars, but if you only have 2 resources to deploy, then here's the challenge with that. One is, in order to use those vehicles to their best efficiency so that they handle the first calls and the engines and trucks aren't running those calls, you would have to change your desired performance from 6 minutes to 8 minutes so that those 2 units could take the first call. Does that make sense? Otherwise, what you could do is those 2 areas may capture 60–70% of all the calls, which is not bad on those chase vehicles, but all of the other stations would have to continue to operate the way they do today by having the first response in order to meet your 6 minutes. So that's the real challenge that we see, where really the right number is 3 or 4 units in order to deploy if you wanted to maintain 6 minutes. I will say that there's nothing materially wrong with an 8-minute travel time. Many large metros have that as their first due response. The clinical research doesn't show a huge distinction one bit or the other between 6 minutes and 8 minutes. So you have the flexibility as a township from the policy perspective of where to set that. We just wanted to point out that you can't just put 2 units in the mix and then all things are equal if that's not the case. So you'll have to have some strategy about how you want to use those resources to the best of your ability. So here's some alternatives. We looked at, now we're moving from chase cars to ALS transport. So we looked at 3 24/7, so 3 24-hour ambulances and then 1 peak ambulance. So if you remember that chart on the temporal part where we looked at the time of day, you really don't have to continue to purchase 24-hour resources. You can start just, as your call volume goes up, just purchase the 12 hours where all of your growth is, because there's plenty of capacity to absorb new growth overnight. There's usually about a 70-30, 60-40 split between the daytime and night. So you can grow at 3, 4, 5% overnight for a considerable period of time before you had to specifically reinvest for that. So the 3 ambulances and then the 1 during the day would maintain your 6 minutes. It's the leanest model that we could put out to cover your demand. And then you can see here, this red line is really what your staffing would be. And then all of these green lines, and this is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And what we want to do is make sure that we cover the most of that. So you can see this is the leanest model because there are going to be times during the day where you still have to retreat and either have some backup, whether it's from AMR or you have a first due engine or somebody, make sure they provide a timely response while the ambulance comes. So you can see there's going to be a little bit of lost potential there to run it that lean. If we looked at that, again, so 3 24/7 and 1 peak with 4 firefighters on a shift reallocation, which is what your union contract did. 3 24/7 and 1 12 with 5 firefighters per shift, which obviously you'd have to renegotiate, but that if you took that, right now you have 4 out of the 5 units, gave up 1 person. If the 5th unit did it as well, you get a little bit of an advantage there. And then 4 24-hour units, not 3 in a peak, but 4 24-hour units and the 5 firefighters per shift. You can see here how that comes out. And it is a little confusing because we did it in the framework of costs, but anything in the parentheses is actually a subsidy. It's a cost to the city, and then the 249 in the middle would actually be the revenue associated with that. And then that would, of course, take additional FTEs in order to do so. So what this would do is a byproduct of this would help the department with the effective response force that we talked about earlier. So you serve an EMS mission, make it at least cost neutral or revenue positive if you can, and then you have the byproduct of increasing the firefighter capacity. But in these 2 scenarios, the 4 up here and this one down here, you need 12 new FTEs, and then you need 8 for the middle one, the leanest one, but that's for the 5th firefighter. So here's another one. If we reduce the fire apparatus, so let's go back to the concept that only 3 stations are needed to meet 92, 93% of all the calls. So the station 1 and 5 aren't necessarily, they're not operationally required. Let me put it that way. There may be other reasons that you want to staff those stations, whether they're political, geographic. There's a whole host of policy-related decisions of why to keep stations. But from a pure operational standpoint, you only need 3 to deliver greater than 90% of the calls. So obviously you would have to work through that because it would change your, the negotiated changes that you just settled, but you'd still have the 21 minimum staffing. That wouldn't change at all. But what you could do is reduce the 3 fire apparatus with 4-person staffing, or reduce the 4 fire apparatus with 3-person staffing. So you have some flexibility there. And you would reallocate the existing personnel to either 4 transport ambulance or chase cars. So if you took the capacity that you would generate from either one of those scenarios, you'd be able to put into service 4 ambulances, which is really what we recommend in order to do a transport model. You'd be able to do that well with existing resources and still cover 90+% of all your calls within the desired 6 minutes. If you took a 4-station model, then there was really only 1 station that's left uncovered, if you will, and our recommendation for that would be staff it as an EMS-only station. So the lion's share of the calls are still going to be handled by the closest unit in the neighborhood that it originated from. So what's the fiscal impact of that? When we look at these scenarios here, it would be about $1.3 million with the 3-engine 4 ambulance, or the 4-engine with 3 persons in the 4 ambulance, because it's the same number of personnel, it's just a different strategy how you wanted to do it. But overall, it'd be about a $1.3 million net profit running the ambulance program that manner. And then if you did the 3 engines, 4 chase cars with the current staff, it would be about $353,000 in net revenue, and that's really associated with the fact that whatever the bundle billing settles out for you, but you'd only be able to bill for the paramedic intercept instead of the full rate if you were in the transport business. So here's your summary of all the EMS alternatives. Again, your kind of baseline where you are today is 417. And then we looked at if you weren't in the EMS game, it would be more costly. And then we put together several different strategies of what you could entertain moving forward with both ALS models within the current framework, as well as what you could look at long term if you reconfigure. So recommendations, in the report we had several. We talked about training and other areas, but really wanted to point out 2 specific areas for you that really had more of a budgetary implication to it. The first is the dispatch. We really believe it's best practice right now to do emergency medical dispatching, medical priority dispatching, which is a call triage system. And what that does, if you've heard of things like a nurse triage line, what the dispatch center would do is actually triage the calls and be able to better align, identify the risk clinically. Now, I'm really talking about EMS calls now. They do have a program for fire and police, but for now, let's just talk about EMS. If you're able to discern the clinical severity at the dispatch center, then you have an opportunity as a township to make better decisions on how you reallocate resources based on that risk. So maybe a cardiac arrest gets 2 or 3 units because it's super timely and you need a lot of hands, and maybe a ground level fall only gets a 2-person unit, but maybe 8 minutes is totally fine because it's not clinically severe. So you really have a lot of flexibility downstream that provides the township with a lot of cost avoidance opportunity as well. So it's a great strategy to invest in the comm center rather than in the response force. So, but that's something that you'd have to work with there. Generally, it will require, depending, and each center is staffed differently, so I don't want to, stand on firm ground on this, but generally a lot of the dispatch centers have to add some supplemental staffing because the time on task is longer to do the call triage, because you ask more questions, you spend a little more time with the citizens on the phone. And then there was some dialogue about whether or not that would be required if you entertain getting your BLS transport license, whether or not you really have to have that kind of capability. We think there could be some improvement in the process with the dispatch, just for some process issues, standardizing, improved data collection, quality assurance, etc. And then again, to be fair, we only took a cursory look at the data, so we're not making any assumptions about what we can or can't do, but we do recommend that you probably take a good third-party look of the communications center, whether it's us or some other firm, or put out the RFP, but take an assessment of the dispatch center, because that you can get such a better return on investment with optimizing the efficiencies available to you in the communication center rather than the downstream trickle of the response side. And then on the prevention, this is one of the things that we did update since the last time we spoke. When we did our initial analyses, we only recommended 1 prevention person to address the workload, but after that first draft came out and we made the presentation, the fire department staff got back with us and we worked with them, and they had some more demand for services that they were able to unsurface and share with us. We concurred with them, and really the recommendation now is at 2 fire prevention FTEs to handle the additional inspections, compliance, etc. And you can see the total cost there. And then we did put in the caveat that you could reevaluate the program once the compliance is met and all the things settle down. You can make a new assessment and decision on that in the future. And with that, that's kind of our high-level summary. We'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you for your presentation. I think this has been a sort of lengthy process from start to finish, but I'm pleased this evening that we set out a task that we wanted to get information and data for. We were able to provide the answers and provide possible solutions to things that we said that we were going to look at. And I think the manager alluded to earlier this evening that tonight was just going to be the overview and the presentation, and then we were going to do much deeper discovery and work into the various components that made up this report. And I think that this approach will lead to a better understanding and hopefully allow us to render better policy decisions and program decisions moving forward if we discuss it in smaller chunks, so that we have the appropriate personnel in the room to ask the questions, and we can actually make some decisions as we're working through this process, so that by the time we wrap this up next February, we're in a different position than we are here this evening, so that it's just in time for next budget season, that we will have a plan in place to move the department forward. And I think that is something that the residents and the people who work for the town, employees in the public safety field, as well as our management, have asked us to do, to have a very comprehensive look to do that. And the only way to accomplish that is to have this very deliberate study and interaction amongst us with respect to the various components. So I think that's the best way to move forward here, because there's so much in here that it will allow us to, in the end, have an accomplishment as to the task with looking at the effectiveness and efficiency of our fire department, our EMS service, and we will then be able to bring back to our community, these are where we ought to be moving towards going forward. And as someone who sat here for quite a period of time, I think planning documents serve a great purpose. And if you look at our conservation, our plan of conservation development, it helps our zoning board determine how parcels ought to be developed. There's an expectation moving forward, and everyone's on the same piece. What may change is the people sitting around the council table, but what ought not change is the direction we need to get from A to Z. So, and I think as we go through this exercise, I think we said before, there may be other departments within the town that we would probably conduct similar studies and examinations going forward. So I'm glad that this is leading off to do that, and I invite all my colleagues to attend all these various workshops to take an active role in understanding what's going on. I don't think it's just the three members that make up the public safety committee who ought to be just involved in this, because at the end of the day, what I think is really important is that we have a plan that's bipartisan, that's well-reasoned, that meets the needs of our community, and our community can afford to implement. And I think that's very important from the outset to understand that going into it, so that no idea that's presented during any of these workshops is a bad idea, but it will be, every idea will be thoroughly vetted, so that in the end we can say, wow, we did this collaboratively, and looking for our management team to bring forward. That's why I met with the manager and the fire chief to outline how we ought to break down this report and move forward. So I don't know if anyone has any questions about the process or the direction that I would like to see us move forward with respect to this particular item, or if you have any other suggestions as to whether I need think this is a bad idea, and I'd like to hear that going forward. I don't really want to get into this whole process, and you say, why well, really not buying into this whole thing. So if there's an objection, I'd like to hear it now. If I don't hear anything, I think that this is the way that we'll just move forward. Mr. Williams, do you have anything?
Well, thanks for the comments, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to ask questions now or proceed, or do you just want to discuss this?
I just wanted to make certain that we're fine with the schedule in terms of how we're going to take this report and going forward. I think we have a framework to work with. I think that's critical. So if there's no objection as to the model we're going to use going forward, then I think you should be fine with it. And then tonight, since we have the representatives from Fitch here, if you have particular questions from the presentation this evening or from the materials, we ought to ask them because they're sitting right in the room. You can get a direct response. I'll refer to you if you have any questions.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you to you both for traveling here and making the presentation. Appreciate it. So I do have a couple follow-ups in different areas. So if you bear with me. The effective response force issue. Can you explain that in layperson's terms? My understanding is that it's an analysis of the time it takes to get a certain number of firefighters to a call. Is that right?
Yes.
And so, in your analysis, when the time goes down in order to respond pursuant to the effective response force criteria, when it goes down from 3-person staffing with EMS, from that number to 3-person staffing with no EMS, is that because the 3-person staffing with the EMS assumes 4 folks in the vehicle?
No.
Okay, so
No.
can you explain to me why the number goes down?
Sure. It's a great question. So let me back up to the origin a little bit in layperson's terms. The national recommendation from the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, suggests that for a single-family residential home that's on fire, they approximate 2,000 square feet with no basement, would require anywhere from 14 to 16 firefighters to effectively mitigate the incident. So they have time parameters that they would like to assemble that. And as I alluded to, most communities would struggle to meet an 8-minute effective response force. It's pretty aggressive standard. What we looked at, when we looked at it's your current stations, current staffing, and this is what percentage of the community you can meet, and I'd have to go back to our report, but I think we use 15%. So the 3-person staffing with EMS is just a reallocation of your current staffing. They'd just be on more units because you'd have two chase cars. But they're still firefighters, they still have their equipment, they can respond. So when we ran the analyses, as long as everybody's available, nothing would change. The last one, the 3-person staffing, no ALS, is really a true reduction. If you didn't reallocate resources, but just reduced the number of personnel, that's when you'd suffer an impact. So what our point was, is that it's not the allocation of personnel, it's whether or not you maintain your 21 or you have some other number that would impact the overall effective response.
Okay, great. That makes all sense. So if I could just state that to you so I understand.
Yep.
So the first one, 3-person staffing with EMS, you're going to have a quicker time of getting the 14 to 16 firefighters to the scene because you assume that when a fire apparatus leaves a firehouse, it's accompanied by an EMS vehicle at the same time. Versus with the 3-person staffing, no EMS, it's just a fire apparatus leaving the firehouse with 3 firefighters on it, so it takes longer for the 4 to 16 to get there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're exactly correct.
So it's not necessarily a timing issue, it's in terms of having emergency personnel on site, it's the number of it's the timing of how long it takes a specific number of personnel to get on scene.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So when you look at this, there's actually 2 parameters. If you look at the first column, we measured at 8, 10, and 12 minutes. So there's your time component. But the rest of it is what percentage of your total geographic area can receive that time parameter. So if we go down to 12 minutes, for example, currently you're about 72, 73%. If you dropped your staffing all the way over to the 3-person ALS, you drop down to 66% at 12 minutes. Now, the more aggressive the time frame, the bigger the variance, the longer it takes, the more recovery that you have, that more personnel.
Okay. And is there a standard beyond, so you just mentioned the standard 2,000 square foot house, no basement, 14 to 16. What, is there a next level?
The only other standard for that, it's not technically a standard, but it comes from the Commission on Fire Accreditation International. And what they've done is they say that as long as you perform at 70% of goal, then you're credible. So the 70th percentile of an 8-minute effective response force is 10 minutes and 24 seconds, and that's how they came up with that standard. So as a baseline service, they'll allow 10:24, and then their goal or benchmark is to be there in 8 minutes. That's generally how it's structured.
Right, I guess my question is, we're talking about 8 minutes and getting 14 to 16 firefighters to a site. Is there a standard that's analyzed about getting a certain higher number of firefighters to a site and pursuant to an effective response force criteria? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I think I do, but let me
Like,
attempt to
I guess
answer.
this is one category, 14 to 16.
Correct.
Is there that higher category?
Yes, there are several. So when NFPA 1710, which is the standard we're looking at, when it originally came out, it only looked at that single-family residential 2,000 square feet. In subsequent editions of that same standard, they added commercial properties, kind of essentially a strip mall, and they added that, and then more recently, I think just in was it 16 or 19, they added the high rise. And then those require, again, based on some task analysis that the committee took note of, there were higher numbers of people with different time frames, so it depends on which type of property.
So why did you guys focus on that, the single family criteria versus the one for
Sure.
strip malls?
Several reasons. First off, it's the one that's been in the standard the longest. And purely from a statistical perspective, it is the more frequent occurrence that you'll have. So one of the things that we did here that we've had to do is we have to do modeling of this, because the number of times that you have a fire that meet that criteria are so small as a relative number that you can't, from a statistical perspective, the results would be bizarre if we sat there and did it based on historical data. So we are able to model that. To do it otherwise, we would have to sit there and get a little bit more detailed within the community. For example, you have areas of the community where you have those properties, commercial properties, strip shopping centers, and other areas where you don't. So it gets a little bit more complex. So we do it predominantly on this. It's the longest standard, and it's also statistically just the more likely scenario for the community.
Okay. So I guess this is not going to be my next question, but sort of segues. When you discuss the impact of removing the EMS program, you indicated in your slide that it does not change staffing considerations. Now, when we've met and we've discussed staffing levels as a continuum, so I think the numbers we were talking about were like 16 to 30 or something like that. And we were spitballing, I'm not going into it. But why did you include that statement here? Are you concluding as part of your opinion here that we have the right number in terms of 20? I'm wondering how you came to that determination in your presentation.
Sure. So another good question. I'll give you two answers to how I arrived at that. One is you're already challenged to assemble 16 personnel with your current 21. Okay? So any reduction we can see will reduce. So if we used a reduction and you go all the way down to 12, 13% of attempting to meet that standard, if that was your desired performance metric. So what we see in, I'll say, smaller to mid-sized communities like yours is there's a balance from a policy and a fiscal perspective of how much risk you can assume and how much protection you want to purchase for the lower frequency event. So it's always a balancing act to find out what that risk tolerance is for you to establish policy. So from that perspective, we thought that, you know, having the staffing that you have today or more is probably the right mix so that you can make sure that you can assemble an effective response force when you need to. So from that perspective, from the historical lens, since you're already there, we felt like you're meeting expectations. There's a reason you arrived at 21 over the years. And we didn't see anything that would specifically say, don't, as a township, maintain 21. It's you know, inefficient and it's not effective. So that's one aspect of why we left it. The other aspect is, and this really goes back to the historical comment that I made about how you got into the ALS program. What we don't want to do as third party is to say that you had a policy process, whether it was this board or another, that established 21 over the years. Then you went to ALS, Chase Car, not Chase Car, but ALS program where you were doing the write-ins. And then now if you want to stop doing ALS, that you would go back to some unknown previous staffing level because you didn't expand. If you expanded with the ALS, we'd probably be more inclined to say you could remove that expansion and go back to where you were. But back to where you were is exactly where you are today. So what we're saying is if you want to choose a different staffing level than you have today, that's an independent policy choice outside of the scope of what we've done. We didn't want to take that kind of liberty to say that you should alter your staffing because you didn't expand in the first place. Is that fair?
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sort of wasn't the focus of your, I mean, it's interesting, and the reason I focus on it is because when we moved to ALS, it was clear if you go back in the record that our town manager at the time considered the ALS versus taking on the minimum man issue. And it's out there in the public record for anyone who wants to review it. So that was the policy decision that was made at the time. There's no one way or the other. And he actually said on the record that he went with this because it was easier. I think that's the exact word he used.
Okay.
Than deal with the minimum man issue. So that's why I sort of focus on this.
Well, and to your point, if you don't mind me interjecting, that's why we focus more on leveraging the transport option than the Chase model option. Because again, you can realize the efficiencies and the capacity that you have in the system and not erode things like your effective response force and add the revenue, the net revenue improvement. So that we took a similar approach of saying, how do we best take the model that you have today and maximize the efficiencies and the revenue impact?
Okay, one more on this one.
Sure.
In determining the response time, how are we calculating that in terms of the cost? Does it make a difference if you're just responding to just fire versus all our calls and come into this calculation? Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, this is a calculation in terms of response times. A certain number of firefighters to site. But if you have 3-person staffing with EMS versus no EMS, the response locations or the number of responses will be different. One will be much higher than the other. Does that differential at all factor in to this calculation? You understand my question?
I'm not sure I totally do.
So,
Yeah, if I may, just at least answer one question. So this only looks, so again, one of the challenges with modeling, because the data set we have is not so large that we can pull from a historical account. This only looks at travel time. So that's the one thing, because when you do the modeling with GIS, we only look at travel time. The other element here is that the underlying assumption is that units within the system are available. So it's a pretty straightforward, math problem, but it's a mapping GIS problem because we have to assume the units are available because the arrival of alarms has been demonstrated in the literature as a poison process. And so I can't say this time it may be a little less or not because of that poison process.
But you did answer my question. So these numbers are based upon our response times with respect to both EMS and firefighters.
It is based on the modeled travel time, which assumes from the location of the station throughout the community, assuming all units are available.
It's not to a specific program area like fire EMS.
Yeah.
What this suggests is of your total geography, 23.09% of the geography can be assembled, 15 people in a
Yeah.
unit.
Okay, you're not actually tracking.
Yeah, that's-
actual-
yeah,
I see what
it
you're
probably
saying.
should-
It's not based on historical performance.
Yeah, so when we do the historical performance, that's based on, we have enough data to actually report that. Now we've moved into the modeling area.
I see what you're saying. So
Is that okay?
you're actually tracking
Yes.
past.
Yes.
As opposed to historical performance.
Yes.
Okay. All right. The unit hour utilization, I have to admit, I don't understand it.
Okay.
Could you, sure, could you just explain it in
Sure.
layperson terms?
Sure. So unit hour utilization, we use a term, it helps us assess how busy the resources are. And it's interesting, Dr. Knight did address it, but I want to maybe emphasize something, especially for people that may be watching this subsequent. Because you say that, let's look at engine 4 medic where they're working 22% of the time. That is how long that unit is committed on an emergency event. From the time they were dispatched until the time they said they were available. Those two elements, that's all that's included, 22%. Now, what we have to recognize, they come in, they have to check out the equipment, there's reports to be written, they've got to restock, but in the fire service, the crews go back available for another call, but they still have tasks to do to kind of fully recover all the way that they are available. The one challenge with that is from a private sector perspective, people go, well, wait a minute, I want that to be 80 or 90%. Here's the problem. If that unit is at 50, 60, 75% of the time they're tied up, then there is a 75% probability when you need them in your neighborhood, they will not be there. Systems have to be designed that the units are available. It is, as Dr. Nygaard referred to, it's a readiness model. We have to ensure that there is a certain amount of time the units are actually free to respond on the call. So we give them other tasks, we ask them to do inspections, they do training, they've got the paperwork to do, et cetera, et cetera. Does that help?
Yeah.
So it's only looking at emergency activity. But what it does is if the medical wasn't there, and that's one of the things that the town took advantage of before, you had capacity in the system, okay, before you took on the ALS. And so you didn't adjust down the number of personnel. You said, let's take that capacity and use it, really recognizing what's happening nationally. In the last 30 years, I think I may have said this when we were before the council before, in the last 30 years, we've seen fire activity in this nation get cut almost in half when you look at structure fires, fire fatalities, fire injuries. And EMS activity, medical activity has gone up 300%. So what you've done is you've taken those resources and recognizing what's happening nationally and happening here, is you've shifted and applied those resources to the benefit of the community without adding cost per se. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question, so if I would just state it back. These, all right?
No, go ahead, I'm trying to get it.
So these numbers would be better in terms of availability if we were responding only to calls.
Oh, you would cut out a significant number of activity, yes. Those numbers would drop. The unit hour utilization would drop significantly.
Probably about 65%.
Do we know what they were prior to the tank? Do we have that data as to what it?
We don't have that data, but I will suggest that the times, and it's not a universal truth, but the times that the unit stays out of service while the medic goes to the hospital, like they follow the hospital, get medications or whatever, that's going to elongate your work effort on your UHU. Under a different scenario, like you're contemplating whether they're chase cars or ambulances, if you can change the resource allocation, then you'll introduce more capacity back on the suppression side, and you have a different resource that can handle those calls.
Is there, by standard, is there sort of an optimal, I mean, the .3 is sort of the
The threshold.
threshold, is that a trouble zone, or is that good? I mean,
No, that's trouble.
Okay,
So,
so,
so we normally say when you get to 0.25, and 25% of the time, we normally encourage the community to say you need to start, we would look at the chief and say you need to start adjusting something. Change which areas they respond to, do something. Because if you don't make some adjustment as it each inches up to the 0.3, he's gonna have to come to the council and say, now I need another vehicle. And that's got a huge fiscal implication. So there are some strategies to try to balance and
But to that point, I will add that this is only for 24-hour units, because there's a lot of research that suggests the clinical cognitive abilities are impacted past the 18th hour. Most industries, whether it's airline, trucking, you name it, has moved away from the 24-hour. So if you do a 12-hour shift, like the peak load ambulance that we were suggesting, you can work those upwards of 50% and really maximize the efficiency, because they don't have to span that 24-hour period. They can clock out and go home. So you really get a lot more efficiency out of that unit if you deploy that way to supplement your baseline 24-hour service.
In my most recent government position, one of our areas of responsibility was a large EMS operation. They ran 12-hour shifts. It was arguably one of the highest performing ambulance systems in the nation. And they were about 48, 49%. When they got over 50, when they hit 51, 52, 53, the managers could see in the metrics and the data that there were some challenges emerging. So we do look at those red lines as a red line.
But if we weren't 100% clear, I'm going to readdress it one more. I'm going to take one more stab at it. That's an upper threshold for workload. It's not a measure of efficiency.
Is that a goal?
Right, it's not a goal, and you're not supposed to be there. It's an upper threshold to where you do have to reinvest.
Yeah, we talk about the readiness model, so you have them available, but we don't have, I mean, the fire personnel don't go out and make their own work, at least we don't want them to. So don't do that, so they kind of have to wait to see what the community is. And what we try to do on the town's behalf is to say, now understanding that you've got those resources deployed, what's the best way to do it based on the demand and the need in your community. And just to answer, if I can take another shot at your question, you said that we have the data. If we assume that all calls took the same amount of time, I'm going to make up a number and say 1 hour. They don't. The medical, when they go to the hospital, take longer, okay? But if they did, and 69, 68% of your activity is EMS, that's what it would cut it by, to give you some sense, right? If I'm not running the call, if the call's for the same amount of time, the math would say that'd be down about 60, 70%. Does that help?
Yep.
Sounds good.
Yeah, go ahead.
So on the chart you showed with the savings, I think you called it revenue, or does that consider the impact of the new equipment that you were?
Yes.
It does?
Yes.
So depreciation and maintenance and all that stuff?
I'm going to go to the summary one. Yes, so embedded in there is if there was new FTEs that was allocated in the cost, when we went through those assumptions, the medical supplies, all those ancillary activities are captured.
And then the second one was, I was just wondering, because you had alluded in one of our earlier meetings that there was some, I think, I don't remember the exact word you said, but interesting data with the dispatch. And now you're recommending that we have a separate study. I was wondering why that would be, and why it wouldn't have been part of this.
Sure, well, the full scope of doing an independent communication center it takes on a life of its own. It's a full study of its own, comparable to what we did here. So we just took a cursory look at the performance as it's related to dispatching fire EMS. So there's a whole lot more that goes on in communication center. Many times law enforcement is 70, 80% more work than fire and EMS related activity. There's a lot of impacts to communication centers today that we didn't have 20 years ago. For example, it takes a lot more time to get the location. Things are getting better with technology, but it takes a lot more time to get locations from cell phone users, which is generally 70+% of the intake calls at the 911 center. So that takes more time. Medical party dispatch, if you were to implement that or entertain that, you'd have to do an analysis on the staffing and intake and time on task so that you allocate enough consoles, people, and everything to account for that. You can't just change that without first understanding what the workload challenges are. So there's a lot of moving parts. But what we found in the data was there was a lot of variability with outliers in the data, where we actually had to run. Usually we only do average and 90th percentile, but we also had to do a median just to get a sense of how the data was skewed. And that's why we went back and tried to refine it with eliminating the outliers. So we don't have any specific criticism other than to say that best practice might be maybe a minute or so faster than the current performance as we've measured, but it probably has enough merit on its own to just go ahead and do a full analysis of the communication center and make sure that it's optimized.
And just to highlight two things that Dr. Knight said, since you do have both police and fire being handled through one dispatch center, you cannot look at them individually. You have to include, you did not include all the workload, all the calls that come in for law, and it would be the majority of stuff. So because that time is extremely critical. So the same sort of thing, the queuing theory that goes into that is how long do they take on a law enforcement call, how long do they take on a fire call, how long do they take on a medical call today, and what would it be with EMD. I've done 2 or 3 of those studies, so we didn't have all the data, and it would be a different piece, but there are, again, as you indicated, there's enough data there to say it probably warrants an additional look. You will almost always, I can say this to everybody I've ever dealt with on 911 studies, and I'm doing some now, you will almost always be better off investing in your 911 system on the front end than making the investment of the resources out in the field, just from a pure cost perspective.
That makes sense.
And there's a lot of, I'm just tying together the strength you opened appropriately, the chair did, with comments that happened elsewhere. There are just so many pieces nowadays that have to get integrated, and the whole business has changed dramatically with cell phones and everything else. That, underlying assumptions of what we designed them a long time ago doesn't apply today, doesn't apply.
Thank you so much. This is really enlightening, and I think it was very helpful, I think, already. But Pat, I completely agree with Mr. David Ogden that, that this roadmap is really important. You're investing and training people, and we need to be on a continuous path. It can't be changing direction, and that is not the right way to spend our taxpayer dollars or run our community. So. A couple of little things. One, this is a quick question. I don't know if you covered this at all. The FTEs for the, on the very end of the prevention recommendations where you are recommending adding trip fire prevention, did that change because of any of the changes in the system, or were that existed in the beginning before you even started to look at this?
Sure, I think I can answer that in 2 manners. One, I believe that would be an autonomous decision. The difference between our first run and where we sit today was the department was able to share some additional workload and work items that they had to accomplish in that division that we didn't capture the first round. And then we heard them out and we validated ourselves and went back and said, yes, we can concur with that and go ahead and support that position. So that's what we did. And then the other aspect, a little more anecdotal, that's why we didn't necessarily, lean heavily on it, because the data, we don't have a data perspective to say one way or the other. But one of the anecdotal comments from the administration is that moving to ALS reduced the capacity of the field crews to enhance what the fire prevention group had. So there might be some dialogue or play with the change for ALS that contributed to this. But we just took it as a mathematical fact of the time on task and the number of activities that they have to accomplish. And we believe in order to adhere to what they need to do, that they would need 2 more FTEs to do so.
So it doesn't sound like ALS created this, but it actually has maybe made it a little more acute. Is that right?
I think that would be a fair assessment, yes.
And then my other question is, we were talking about even 5 years ago with cell phones, the amount of calls coming into dispatch and how the dynamic would have changed in 5 or 10 years. 10 years was I'm sure, completely different. And then 5 years from now, it's going to look very different. What is the element or any planning for technology and even delivery of medical services with technology with a paramedic, and the opportunity maybe for revenue through that, and a service to the community, number one, and revenue opportunities? Are you looking?
We'd have to wait on the federal government from a revenue perspective. It has changed dramatically. So cell phone calls in most 911 centers across the nation, so I'll look at the chief, he may know, 75–80% of your calls coming in are cell phone calls. Where we used to have somebody have a vehicle accident in the neighborhood and one person would hear it and go to their landline phone on copper and call. Now 15 people call to tell you that, right? And they don't know location, it's harder for the operators to do it. You also have things like next generation 911, where today, it's copper and it's just voice. Now you're going to have next gen, where you're going to have video and all sorts of other elements. That opportunity also exists from programs like community paramedicine, et cetera, where you have high demand. You can identify, Dr. Knight was talking about the call prioritization piece, emergency medical dispatch. You can prioritize lower acuity calls and come up with alternatives to get that patient more rapid care at a more appropriate location if you can do a proper assessment. So all of that requires the technology to be in place, the next gen. And again, it goes back to that investment in 911. That investment there will avoid more units on the street, even sometimes more officers, et cetera. So there's opportunities there, but from a revenue perspective, not unless the federal government changes. And there are, by the way, some pilot programs that the federal government is doing, recognizing the value that the old model was you only got paid when you took somebody to a hospital, and the hospitals are screaming that they don't have room. So we're seeing a very, very slow shift. There'll also be, as NG9, Next Generation 911 comes out, there will be some grant dollars, more and more grant dollars available from the feds down to the state levels to help fund those in communities, so there'll be those opportunities. But for a recurring revenue stream, probably not.
They are launching currently something called ET3, it's emergency triage transport model. So at least they're exploring, I think it's a 5-year test window. So they're at least going to explore how to get better revenue structures associated. Because right now, the only revenue, largely, the only revenue is if you transport.
Thank you for this very comprehensive analysis. It's very helpful. I'm just sort of curious, Chief Priest, and those of you who work in the fire department, any insight, any surprises, any thoughts, anything that stuck out, like, oh, I didn't know that, or anything that you'd like to share?
That's an excellent question. So I don't think that anything jumped out at us. I think what this did for us is it compiled a lot of data across a lot of areas in the fire department and gave us an opportunity to look at it in kind of a consolidated fashion. It was nice to see some of the dispatch information and kind of look at it, recognize that we have to work together. It prompted some great discussions with our bargaining unit, and it also validated some of the things that we're doing today. But I think it's really shown us some places that we need to look at, some places that we need to make some decisions inside of the department and as a group of policy folks. I mean, we identified a couple of areas in terms of maybe some of our turnout times, but I think it kind of validates our performance right now and that we're providing a good service to the community. And I think as we get into some of these more granular discussions, over these, we'll have an opportunity to kind of really see what our policymakers have in mind, and I can also launch some more of my opinions more directly in some of the particular areas.
Anyone else have any other questions?
Just for the public, to the extent that they watch this, I'm sure they're curious. Your revenue projections are based on the models you're exploring. They didn't look at, as we discussed earlier, things like the minimum man issue and calculation, where if we change that, what the revenues or savings would be versus the EMS programs you're proposing, correct?
Yes, everything either maintained your current 21 staffing or they were enhancement model. Right. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Anything further? I guess I'll just go last. I do appreciate all the hard work that went into this. I'd like to thank all the people who participated in providing the data from the management side as well from our personnel. Give them the facts to work with to bring this report forward to the council this evening. So I think that's a very important, crucial next step will be to do this examination in a very methodical way to get us from point A to Z. And what I think is really important in this entire thing is I think we've learned that there's going to be a lot of collaboration between fire, police, and EMS going forward. We saw that when we did the capital expenditure to update our communication system as to where we also located transmitters, so that our town could be fully covered, so that regardless of where you were in the community. We recently had, in this last budget, funds allocated for a civilian dispatch personnel, which is meeting another standard that we know. And what's really great about this entire thing is that while this document and the other work that's to come will be put in one place, it's a living document and it's fluid to meet the needs of the community as the needs change, and as technology changes and as expectations change. So I think we're in a good place. That's why West Hartford is a premier community, not only in the state of Connecticut, but nationwide. We're willing to examine the services we provide so that we can do it better. And I think this evening demonstrated that we've gotten off to a really good start, and thank you, gentlemen, for working with our community to do that. I don't know if the manager has anything further before we wrap up for this evening.
Well, thank you all again for attending. This has been a very, very important project for the town. And as Councilor Davidoff said earlier, you're receiving a lot of information in this report. A lot of it is highly technical in nature. As a management team, we certainly think it makes sense to take it in chunks and step through it in a more deliberate way to come up with a long-term preferred plan and vision for the department. I would ask the chief to speak just briefly to the good things we'll be doing in the interim with the negotiated changes with the collective bargaining agreement, how we'll be moving into some intercept and potentially some limited transport.
Thank you. The best way of putting it is I think that we're going to take the negotiated changes and we're going to take some of the data that we have from Fitch, and we're going to place those light-duty EMS vehicles in town, and we're going to closely evaluate the response times. But one of the key cornerstones before we make those changes is to make sure that we're working with the dispatch center to be able to make sure that we're properly sending the right unit into the town and making sure that we're actually capturing the data so that we can make informed decisions about where we want to place the units and also what the impact of it is. As Dr. Knight had indicated, we will still need to use some of our fire apparatus to some capacity to be able to make sure that we're meeting our response time goals. But those are the things that I want to elicit out of running this particular deployment model for a period of time so that we actually have data inside of our community showing how quickly we're getting to calls and making sure that we're not going backwards or taking and elongating response times from the citizens. So, it really comes down to a matter of, refining our dispatch processes. And as part of the refinement of the dispatch processes, we will actually have a better capture on the actual amount of calls that our fire department is necessary to go on. And I think that that's an important metric that we have to carry, because if our transports are changing or the amount of calls are changing, then I believe that we have to be cautious and we have to make sure that we're understanding what the revenue streams will do if our call volume goes up. But over a period of time, really, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to be good at ALS intercept, and we're going to gather a data set to do that. So the manager referred to transport, and I think that that's a discussion that we need to have a little bit longer. We've been privileged to be watching some of the processes in the state recently about how people go to gain the right and ability to do transport. I would go back to the point that was brought up by Dr. Knight as well, that we do believe that we have to be good and clean in our dispatch processes. We have to be good and clean in our data recovery and analysis in order for us to be able to move forward with any sort of transport options. We have already been in discussions with AMR to make sure that we're trying to optimize our billing, to make sure that we have a bundle billing agreement with them. And we're also going to be speaking with them a little bit more about whether or not there's any opportunities for transport, although it's probably not likely. It's still a discussion that we should have on behalf of our residents to make sure that we've looked at all of those possibilities.
Thank you. So, saying nothing further, I think, thank you.
Thank you.